Today, the president made what are widely called unusual, perhaps unprecedented remarks in the modern era. And I'm going to show you exactly what he said and why military veterans and many other experts on a nonpartisan basis say this is one of those inflection points you need to confront. It is unusual to gather this many members of the military in peacetime. The president made this public address so everyone can see and hear what he is saying to the military. And he explicitly said this military under this Trump administration must better focus on attacking, quote, the enemy within. And as for the controversial and sometimes legally overruled use of just the National Guard in America, the president rhetorically pushing past that, explaining that he views the military, which we'll show you was quite.
Okay, so this is absolutely historic. And I mean that literally. This is the most dramatic judicial protest in modern American history. A Supreme Court justice literally walked out of a session, like got up, walked out, left the courtroom in the middle of proceedings to protest what Trump is doing. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically walked out. This has never happened before. Judges don't do this. Judges maintain decorum. Judges stay professional. Judges don't make dramatic statements by walking out of courtrooms. But this Supreme Court justice did. Why? Because Trump has crossed a line that judges in America have never seen a president cross before. Trump publicly declared that constitutional limits don't apply to him. Trump publicly stated that the Constitution doesn't bind his power. Trump openly defied the idea that judges have the authority to check his executive power. And when Trump said this, when Trump went on television and basically said the Constitution is not binding on him, a Supreme Court justice couldn't take it anymore. The justice walked out. It was a moment of absolute constitutional crisis, and it signals that the judiciary has reached its breaking point with Trump's brazen defiance of constitutional limits. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
And he did not leave peacefully. We all lived through that. This was a vindictive tone from the president today. I'll let you hear it for yourself as he insists U.S. troops should now target Americans, which he calls, again, the politician, his opinion, he calls them the domestic enemy.
Last month, I signed an executive order to provide training for quick reaction force that can help quell civil disturbances. This is going to be a big thing for the people in this room because it's the enemy from within, and we have to handle it before it gets out of control. While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
This all started with a Supreme Court ruling on October 23rd, 2025. The court, by a 7-2 majority, ruled against Trump's emergency tariff policies. The court said Trump couldn't just declare emergencies and use them to bypass Congress and impose tariffs without legislative authority. The court said Trump exceeded his constitutional powers. The court said the Constitution has limits on executive authority, and Trump violated those limits. It was a clear rebuke of Trump's claim that he has unlimited emergency power. It was the judiciary doing its job, checking executive overreach and enforcing constitutional limits on presidential power. But Trump's response was not acceptance or compliance. Trump's response was defiance. Trump went on television and said the Constitution doesn't apply to him. Trump said judges don't have the authority to limit his power. Trump basically declared that the separation of powers is dead and he's going to do whatever he wants. That's insane. That's authoritarian. That's a direct attack on the Constitution itself. And that's what triggered the Supreme Court justice's walkout. The justice apparently was in court on October 29th, 2025, 6 days after Trump's public defiance, and couldn't maintain composure anymore. The justice got up and walked out of the courtroom. No announcement, no explanation given at the moment. Just a physical protest to Trump's constitutional defiance. And legal experts are saying this is unprecedented in modern American history. They can't find a comparable example of a Supreme Court justice walking out of a session to protest a sitting president. This is how extreme the situation has become. This is how fed up the judiciary is with Trump's assault on constitutional order. The walkout was a visceral expression of judicial alarm at Trump's open contempt for the Constitution and the courts. But here's the thing. The Supreme Court justices' walkout is just the beginning. Federal judges nationwide have been pushing back against Trump's attempts to undermine judicial authority. Judges have been increasingly vocal about their concerns. Judges have been issuing opinions that emphasize the importance of constitutional limits on executive power. Judges have been warning that Trump's actions represent an existential threat to American democracy. It's not just one angry justice. It's the entire federal judiciary raising alarms about what Trump is doing. Judge after judge is coming out and saying, this is too much. Trump is crossing constitutional lines. Trump is threatening the separation of powers. Trump is threatening the rule of law. And when the entire federal judiciary is united in alarm about something, that's a signal that we are in serious constitutional trouble. The cases challenging Trump's emergency powers and executive overreach are piling up in courts nationwide. Judges are looking at Trump's actions and ruling against him repeatedly. Judges are saying, no, Trump cannot do this. Trump does not have the authority to do this. The Constitution limits Trump's power, and judges will enforce those limits. These rulings are coming from judges appointed by Republicans and judges appointed by Democrats. These rulings are coming from conservative judges and liberal judges. It's not partisan. It's the entire judiciary understanding that Trump has gone too far and is threatening constitutional order. When judges across the ideological spectrum are united in opposing Trump's executive overreach, that's a sign that Trump's conduct is objectively unconstitutional and threatening to democratic governance. The legal experts and constitutional scholars are also sounding the alarm. They're saying the walkout represents the most dramatic judicial protest in modern American history. They're saying Trump is testing the Constitution in ways that no president has tested it before. And they're saying the judiciary is essentially at war with the Trump administration over fundamental questions about the separation of powers and constitutional limits on executive authority. This is not normal politics. This is a genuine constitutional crisis. This is the judiciary essentially saying, we are not going to allow you to destroy the Constitution and the separation of powers. We are going to fight you. We are going to use every power we have to enforce constitutional limits on your authority. And if you continue to defy us, if you continue to claim the Constitution doesn't apply to you, we are going to escalate our response. Trump's rhetoric has been absolutely shocking because he's not being subtle about his contempt for constitutional limits. Trump is openly declaring that constitutional boundaries don't apply to him. Trump is openly claiming that judicial oversight is illegitimate. Trump is openly asserting unchecked presidential power. These are not dog whistles or subtle hints at authoritarian intentions. This is direct, unambiguous assertion of power beyond constitutional limits. It's brazen, it's contemptuous of the Constitution, it's contemptuous of the courts, and it's absolutely triggering an unprecedented judicial response. Judges who normally maintain professional decorum, who normally keep their personal views private, who normally express themselves only through written opinions, are now making dramatic public statements and physical protests against Trump's constitutional defiance. That's how extreme the situation has become. So let's dig deeper into what's actually happening here and why a Supreme Court justice's walkout is such a serious sign of constitutional crisis. For most of American history, the separation of powers has been a basic operating principle of government. The Constitution divides power among three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. No single branch has unlimited power. Each branch checks and balances the others. The president cannot do whatever he wants. Congress can pass laws that limit presidential authority. Judges can rule that presidential actions violate the Constitution. This system has worked, not perfectly, but reasonably well, for over 200 years. Presidents have tested the boundaries. Presidents have claimed expansive emergency powers, but even presidents who pushed executive authority to the limits generally accepted that judges have the power to review their actions and rule them unconstitutional if necessary. Trump is different. Trump is openly challenging the basic principle that judges have authority to check his power. Trump is openly claiming that he can ignore court rulings if he disagrees with them. Trump is openly asserting that the Constitution doesn't limit his emergency powers. This is not a president pushing the boundaries of executive authority within the existing constitutional framework. This is a president openly rejecting the constitutional framework itself. This is a president asserting dictatorial power beyond constitutional limits. And judges, who are supposed to be the guardians of the Constitution and the enforcement mechanism for constitutional limits on executive power, are facing an existential question. What do we do when a sitting president openly rejects our authority to check his power? The Supreme Court's 7-2 ruling against Trump's emergency tariff policies was supposed to be a clear message to Trump that he cannot exceed his constitutional authority. 7 out of 9 justices agreed that Trump violated the Constitution. That's a supermajority. That's as clear a judicial message as possible. You cannot do this. You don't have the authority to do this. The Constitution limits your power. But instead of accepting the ruling and complying with the court's decision, Trump went on television and said the Constitution doesn't apply to him. Trump said judges don't have authority to limit his power. Trump basically said he's going to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling and do whatever he wants anyway. From the Supreme Court's perspective, this is an absolute rejection of judicial authority. This is Trump declaring war on the judiciary. And that's what triggered the justices' walkout. The justice apparently understood that this is a moment where the judiciary has to take a stand. The justice understood that if the court allows Trump to openly defy its rulings, if the court allows Trump to claim the Constitution doesn't apply to him, if the court allows Trump to reject judicial authority, then the separation of powers is dead. The courts become meaningless, presidential power becomes unchecked, democracy becomes impossible. So the justice walked out. The justice made a dramatic statement that this is unacceptable, this is too much, this cannot stand. And the walkout has apparently emboldened other judges to speak out more forcefully about the constitutional crisis. Federal judges nationwide are issuing opinions that are increasingly direct and forceful in their language about Trump's constitutional defiance. Judges are no longer using the careful, neutral language that judges typically use. Judges are using language like existential threat to democracy. Judges are using language like assault on the Constitution. Judges are using language like rejection of the rule of law. Judges are calling Trump's conduct what it is, an attempt to consolidate unchecked executive power and destroy constitutional democracy. And these opinions are coming from judges across the ideological spectrum. Conservative judges appointed by Republican presidents are joining liberal judges appointed by Democratic presidents in warning about Trump's constitutional defiance. That kind of judicial unity is extremely rare. That kind of judicial unity only happens when judges understand that something fundamental is at stake. And in this case, that something is the entire constitutional order. The cases challenging Trump's emergency powers are also revealing the depth of Trump's contempt for constitutional authority. Trump is asserting emergency powers to bypass Congress and impose policies without legislative authority. Trump is using executive orders to establish regulations that violate statutory law. Trump is directing executive agencies to ignore court orders. Trump is essentially governing as if the Constitution and the courts don't exist. Judges are looking at this conduct and ruling against Trump repeatedly. But Trump's response is not compliance. Trump's response is defiance. Trump's response is assertions that judges don't have authority to check his power. So judges are faced with a situation where their rulings are being openly defied by the president. That's a constitutional crisis. That's a situation where the basic operating principles of the American government system are breaking down. The precedent that judges are setting with their statements in the Supreme Court justices' walkout is also significant because it signals that the judiciary is willing to escalate its response to Trump's constitutional defiance. If Trump continues to ignore court rulings, if Trump continues to claim the Constitution doesn't apply to him, if Trump continues to reject judicial authority, judges are prepared to take extraordinary measures to enforce constitutional limits on presidential power. The walkout is a warning. The opinions criticizing Trump's conduct are warnings. The judicial unity against Trump's defiance is a warning. The message is clear. Comply with the Constitution and with court rulings, or the judiciary will escalate its response. But what does escalation look like? Some legal experts are speculating that judges might begin holding Trump in contempt of court. Some are suggesting that judges might refuse to enforce executive orders that violate the Constitution. Some are suggesting that judges might take unprecedented action to protect the constitutional order. Trump's assertion that the Constitution doesn't bind his power is also revealing about his fundamental misunderstanding of the American constitutional system. The entire point of the Constitution is to create limits on government power. The entire point of constitutional democracy is that no single person, not even the president, has unlimited power. The president takes an oath to uphold the Constitution. That oath is not symbolic. That oath is a binding commitment to respect constitutional limits on presidential authority. When Trump rejects that oath, when Trump says the Constitution doesn't apply to him, Trump is breaking his oath. Trump is committing a constitutional violation. Trump is potentially engaging in conduct that could constitute high crimes and misdemeanors, which is grounds for impeachment. The GOP's response to this constitutional crisis is also revealing. Republicans have generally remained silent about Trump's constitutional defiance. Some Republicans have made vague statements about respecting the judiciary, but most have refused to directly confront Trump on his assertion that the Constitution doesn't apply to him. That silence is complicity. That silence signals that Republicans are prioritizing party loyalty over constitutional governance. If Republicans were genuinely committed to the Constitution, Republicans would be directly challenging Trump's claim that he can ignore constitutional limits on his power. But they're not. They're staying silent. They're hoping the controversy goes away. And that silence is making the constitutional crisis worse because it signals that Trump might not face political consequences for his constitutional defiance. Okay, so let's break down what the Supreme Court justices' walkout and the broader judicial pushback means for Trump's presidency and for American constitutional order. There are basically four critical things you need to understand about why this is such a serious moment and what comes next. First, the walkout signals that the judiciary has reached its breaking point with Trump's constitutional defiance. The Supreme Court justice did not walk out casually or for minor reasons. The justice walked out because Trump openly declared that the Constitution doesn't apply to him. The justice walked out because Trump is openly rejecting judicial authority to check executive power. The justice walked out because the fundamental constitutional order is under assault. That's a serious message. That's a justice saying, I cannot sit in this courtroom and pretend that this is normal politics while Trump is attacking the Constitution itself. The walkout is a line in the sand. The walkout signals that judges are prepared to take extraordinary action to defend the Constitution if Trump continues his constitutional defiance. Second, the judicial unity against Trump's constitutional overreach is unprecedented in modern American history. Judges appointed by Republican presidents are joining judges appointed by Democratic presidents in opposing Trump's assault on constitutional order. Conservative judges are joining liberal judges. Judges who are typically cautious about making political statements or making forceful statements about Trump's threat to democracy. This kind of judicial unity doesn't happen by accident. This kind of judicial unity only happens when judges understand that something existential is at stake. And in this case, what's at stake is the Constitution itself. What's at stake is the separation of powers. What's at stake is judicial authority to enforce constitutional limits on executive power. When the entire federal judiciary unites to oppose something, that's a signal that Trump's conduct is objectively unconstitutional and objectively threatening to the American system of government. Third, Trump's claim that the Constitution doesn't apply to him is essentially a claim that he's above the law. If the Constitution doesn't apply to Trump, then no law applies to Trump. If judges don't have authority to check Trump's power, then nothing checks Trump's power. Trump becomes a dictator. Trump becomes an authoritarian leader with unchecked power. And judges understand that their constitutional duty is to prevent that outcome. Judges understand that their job is to enforce the Constitution and maintain the separation of powers. So judges are prepared to fight back against Trump's assault on constitutional order. They're prepared to issue ruling after ruling against Trump's executive overreach. They're prepared to hold Trump accountable if Trump violates court orders. They're prepared to escalate their response if Trump continues his defiance. Fourth, this constitutional crisis is going to reshape Trump's presidency and force a reckoning with the fundamental question of whether American democracy can survive a president who openly rejects constitutional limits on his power. Congress is going to face pressure to act. If Trump continues to defy court rulings, if Trump continues to claim the Constitution doesn't apply to him, Congress might be forced to impeach Trump for high crimes and misdemeanors. But Republicans control Congress, and Republicans have generally been unwilling to act against Trump. So the question becomes, at what point do Republicans prioritize the Constitution over party loyalty? At what point do Republicans decide that Trump's assault on constitutional order is too much? The Supreme Court justices' walkout is putting pressure on Republicans to answer those questions. Here's what's going to happen in the immediate future. First, Trump is going to continue testing the limits of constitutional authority because Trump interprets judicial silence as permission to continue. Trump is going to issue more executive orders that violate the Constitution. Trump is going to assert more emergency powers that exceed his constitutional authority. Trump is going to defy more court rulings. And judges are going to respond by issuing more rulings against Trump. and becoming increasingly forceful in their language, criticizing Trump's constitutional defiance. You're going to see a judicial executive standoff where judges are trying to enforce constitutional limits, and Trump is openly defying those limits. Second, the Supreme Court's legitimacy is going to be tested by Trump's defiance. If Trump openly defies the Supreme Court's rulings, if Trump ignores Supreme Court orders, then the Supreme Court's authority becomes questionable. The Supreme Court has no army, the Supreme Court has no law enforcement, the Supreme Court depends on the executive branch to enforce its rulings, but if the president refuses to enforce Supreme Court rulings, then the Supreme Court's power becomes essentially symbolic. That's a serious threat to judicial authority and to the Constitution itself. So the Supreme Court is probably going to become increasingly aggressive in defending its authority. The Supreme Court might issue multiple rulings against Trump in rapid succession. The Supreme Court might use its opinions to build a public case against Trump's constitutional defiance. The Supreme Court might even call for Trump's removal or impeachment. Third, Congress is going to come under enormous pressure to act. Members of Congress are going to face constituents who ask, why aren't you stopping Trump from destroying the Constitution? Members of Congress are going to face judges who are essentially asking for congressional action to defend the Constitution. Members of Congress are going to understand that if they don't act to limit Trump's power, the Constitution becomes meaningless. Some Democrats are probably going to introduce articles of impeachment against Trump. Some Republicans might break ranks and support impeachment because Trump's assault on the Constitution is too blatant to ignore. Even if impeachment fails in the Senate because Republicans block conviction, the impeachment process itself will be a serious moment of reckoning where Congress has to decide whether it's going to defend the Constitution or allow Trump to destroy it. Fourth, the American people are going to face a choice about what kind of government they want. Do Americans want a constitutional democracy where power is limited by law and courts enforce those limits? Or do Americans want an authoritarian system where the president has unchecked power and can ignore courts and the Constitution? Trump's constitutional defiance is forcing that choice into the open. Trump is making clear that he wants unchecked power. Trump is making clear that he views the Constitution as an obstacle to overcome rather than a framework to respect. The American people are going to have to decide whether they support Trump's claim that he's above the law and can ignore the Constitution, or whether they support constitutional democracy where everyone, including the president, is subject to law and constitutional limits. The bigger picture here is that America is experiencing a genuine constitutional crisis. The Supreme Court justice's walkout is a sign of how serious the crisis has become. The walkout is judges saying, we cannot tolerate this anymore. We cannot sit quietly while Trump destroys the Constitution. We are going to stand up and defend the constitutional order. And once judges start making dramatic statements like walkouts, once judges start abandoning their traditional professional detachment, you know the situation is at a breaking point. The next phase of this crisis is going to be ugly. There's going to be a showdown between the judicial branch and the executive branch. Congress is going to be drawn into the conflict. The American people are going to have to take sides. And the outcome of this conflict is going to determine whether the Constitution survives Trump's assault on constitutional order. Trump's open defiance of the Constitution is not normal politics. It's not a policy disagreement. It's not a debate about the scope of executive authority. It's an assault on the Constitution itself. It's an assertion that the president can govern as an unchecked dictator. It's a rejection of the foundational principles of American democracy. And judges who are supposed to be the guardians of the Constitution are rising to defend it. The Supreme Court justice's walkout is a signal that the judiciary is going to fight back against Trump's assault on constitutional order. More rulings against Trump are coming. More judicial criticism of Trump's constitutional defiance is coming. Possible escalation of judicial action is coming. Trump is about to face a judiciary that is united, vocal, and prepared to enforce constitutional limits on his power. This is the moment where the Constitution fights back. This is the moment where judges decide they cannot sit quietly while a president destroys the constitutional order. And it only gets more intense from here. Stay tuned, because the next phase of this constitutional crisis is going to be absolutely historic and absolutely wild.